All right. Welcome to the UNM Law and Mental Health series, weekly discussions of practice and science featuring experts in behavioral health and the law. This series is run by the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences of UNM's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, in support with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Kaisa Marshall, an assistant professor here at UNM. For our talk today, please ask questions in the Q&A box anytime that you feel comfortable, but just know that we will not get to them until the end. Also, we always try to do our best to get to as many questions as possible, but please forgive us if we don't get to yours. If you are pursuing continuing medical education, the sign-in sheet will be in the chat shortly. If you are pursuing APA continuing education, the link will appear later, around the 50-minute mark. And be sure to save your certificate after you completed the survey because we don't keep copies. If you missed our most recent talk in the series, Dr. Natalie Anumba and Dr. Laura Guzman-Hasta, discussion of mentoring and supporting underrepresented professionals is now available on our YouTube channel. The link for that channel will also be posted in the chat box. The recording for this week's talk will be available on our YouTube page later this week, and the PowerPoint slides will also be accessible for those who registered for the series later in the week as well. As a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we will have Dr. Georgia Winters, who will be discussing sexual grooming behaviors, applying research to practice. But let's get back to this week. I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker, who will be discussing adolescent development and the juvenile justice system. This is Dr. Caitlin Cavanagh. Dr. Cavanagh is an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, and currently a member at large of the American Psychology and Law Society. She's a developmental psychologist who works with juvenile courts to research how juvenile justice system policy and practice can be more supportive of the needs of marginalized youth and their families. So, Dr. Cavanagh, on behalf of UNM, we're excited to have you join our series and thankful for you to be sharing your expertise with us today. I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that great introduction. And I so appreciate the opportunity to speak with this group today. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get the PowerPoint going. Okay. Everything looks good so far? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Great. So I'm here today to talk to you about adolescent development and the juvenile justice system. I want to first do some level setting about the lens that I'm coming to this conversation with. So my training is in developmental psychology as a researcher. So I am not a clinician. I know I'm speaking to lots of people who might be clinicians or might be more in that clinical space. And I want to be clear that that is not me. I'm a researcher and I study how kids grow and develop over time. Specifically, I'm interested in the juvenile justice system and the impact of juvenile justice system contact on that kind of normative adolescent development. So I really see my research as kind of falling into somewhere in this Venn diagram of the juvenile justice system, policy and law, adolescent development, and family dynamics. In addition to being a researcher and an associate professor at MSU, I am also the research advisor for two juvenile courts, two family courts in the state of Michigan, the 13th and the 30th Circuit Courts. And in that role, I kind of work directly with the juvenile justice practitioners to help them better collect and understand data that can then shape the policy and practice that those jurisdictions use toward better and more developmentally supportive practice in those juvenile courts so that youth and families are better supported. So a lot of the research that I'll talk about today kind of comes from that more community engaged, working directly with some juvenile courts. There we go. Oh, I gave up the game. So here I just have kind of a brief description of the central questions to my research, which is how can our laws and policies better support youth developmental needs when they come into contact with the justice system so that families, youth, and legal actors can work together more effectively towards safe communities. So that is the kind of guiding thesis statement of the research that I do. And particularly, I really find it grounding to remember remember that we can't change what we don't understand. So oftentimes when we are talking about the legal system, the justice system, there can be enormous frustration about unequal outcomes or outcomes that are more harmful than they are helpful. And I think that research in this space is incredibly important because we can't build safer communities and a more effective justice system until we understand the needs of the families that are being served by those systems. So that is what I aim to do. Here's a brief outline for what I'll be covering today. First, I'll just give a little primer on adolescent development and risk-taking. So this will be some kind of state of the science. This is what we know about adolescent development and how it impacts how you think about taking risks and decision-making. Then I'll talk about how youth are differently resourced than adults when we consider kind of what they have available to them, which is directly related to their experience within the justice system. And then lastly, I'll talk about some of my work that has to do with the family context, especially the parenting context around youth crime. So we'll start with just some background level setting on adolescent development and risk-taking. So I really love this chart. What we're looking at here is the peaks of brain development. And one of those peaks totally makes sense. That's the fetal period. So before birth, of course, the brain needs to constitute itself. And so there's a peak in brain development during that time. The second major peak in brain development happens in the ages of between 2 and 3. I actually had some family friends staying with me this weekend who have a 2.5-year-old. And as many of you know who may have interacted with toddlers, just the growth that they are experiencing at that time is enormous. You know, from gross and fine motor skills to language development, we could see a lot of brain development is happening and kind of how that's manifesting in those toddler years. But what's always really interesting to me as a developmental psychologist is that there's this third peak of brain development around ages 14 to 15 that is like kind of just as important as the fetal period and the toddlerhood period, but we often don't kind of recognize it externally in the same way. Whereas we can say, oh, wow, this infant that used to not be able to speak or move, now at age 2 or 3, like they've developed so much and their brains are growing like crazy, and we can really see that from the outside. But a lot of the brain development that happens in the teenage years is kind of less culturally recognized and less visible to us, but it's a peak of brain development nonetheless. So what's going on in that period? Well, adolescence is a period of immense physical, social, and cognitive transition, as well as psychological transition. What you're looking at here is a beautiful picture of myself at age 13. I'm the one on the farthest to the left in a navy blue dress. This was our 8th grade dinner dance. And what I love about this picture is that all of our dates are, you know, a solid 6 inches shorter than us. And I use this picture to demonstrate that this growth does not happen in the same way for everyone all the time. So adolescence is this period of enormous development and enormous growth, with the caveat that whenever I say ages, like, oh, this should happen by age 15 or 16, that's not necessarily going to be the same for everyone. And that's really important, I think, for practitioners to keep in mind as they work with kids. So what does that cognitive development look like? I want to focus there for a second. Teenagers have an improved capacity to use logic and grasp abstract concepts. So what that means is they're able to think in more shades of gray, whereas younger children tend to think in more black and white terms. Things are good or bad. Teenagers can understand, for example, the concept of an anti-hero. And so that improved capacity to use logic and grasp abstract concepts comes online in the teenage years and often manifests itself as being argumentative. So maybe if you've interacted with a teenager before, I'm thinking of my own nieces and nephews, in those teen years, they might seem so argumentative. It's like, oh, they'll argue with anything you say. That's honestly because they are exercising a new muscle to them, this ability to kind of think in a different way than they could before. During the adolescent years, cognition gets faster and more efficient. That's thanks to increased myelination and synaptic pruning within the brain. But that cognition also gets highly sensitive to rewards. So what that means is kids are able to think faster, more efficiently. They're able to process quicker, more efficiently in the adolescent years. But they're really, really sensitive to rewards, and that's because of the reorganization of the dopamine receptors that happens around that time. Another cognitive change that happens is adolescents gain a lot more complex social cognition. So what that means is they're much more aware of other people's thoughts and how their behavior might impact what someone else thinks about them, for example. And in concert with the fact that adolescents are more sensitive to rewards, what this means is that peers become very rewarding at this time. So adolescents are able to understand that their peers have their own interior worlds. They're able to grasp those more abstract concepts, and they feel really sensitive to rewards. So what that means is, in total, peers become really rewarding. However, what all of these changes also mean is that there's a big spike in risky behavior in the teen years, and we see this across tons of different types of risky behavior. So this is the age curve for driver deaths, for example, which peaks in the late teens. We see that in binge drinking trajectories, which also peaks in the late teens. And of course, we see it in criminal behavior, which is a special subtype of risky behavior that violates the law. What you're looking at here is very famous in the criminology literature. It's called the age crime curve. And it's this pattern that we see across cultures, across time, across gender, across crime types, where we see the same pattern where different types of crime tend to peak, tend to spike in the teen years. So here we're looking at violent and nonviolent crime, which we're seeing peaking around 16, 17. Again, this is called the age crime curve. But we also see here we're looking at males and females, same pattern. We do see that males tend to engage in more criminal behavior than females, but the peak is the same in those teen years. Here, this is a comparison of an indigenous group and a European group, same peak. And then here we're looking across time. This is just looking at the past 30 years. However, there is demonstrated evidence of this age crime curve going back over 100 years. I just don't have a beautiful graph to show you about it. So we see the same pattern again and again where risky behavior, particularly behavior that is risky and violates the law, tends to peak during those adolescent years. But I just told you that adolescents are gaining all these capacities. So if adolescents are so smart, then why are they doing such stupid things? Why are they engaging in this behavior that then puts them at risk of being involved in the justice system? Well, it's because of the timing of that brain development. So here what we're looking at are a series of brains from a younger person to somebody in their 20s. And what we're seeing, this is a gross analogy that my students love to hate. When we think about brain development, it doesn't happen at the same time kind of uniformly. So I like to think of it as when you're cooking a turkey for Thanksgiving and maybe some part of the turkey is already cooked, but you've got to put that thermometer into the other part to make sure it's all cooked all the way through. The same is true with our brain as the brain develops. It's not necessarily developing uniformly. So what that means is there's this part that we can see here that's outlined in this white box. That's the last part of the brain that fully develops, and that's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The reason that this matters so much, this prefrontal cortex is kind of right in front by your forehead. The reason that it matters is because it is the part of your brain that's in charge of what we call psychosocial maturity. So this includes things like impulse control, resistance to peer influence, future orientation, or kind of planning for the future, being able to perceive risks, and not being as interested in sensation seeking. So what this means is because adolescents have all these great cognitive capacities that come online in kind of the teen years, their intellectual ability might reach adult levels maybe around the age of 16. But that more psychosocial capacity that is governed by the prefrontal cortex, the last part of the brain to develop, that development continues into early adulthood. And so what that means is there's literally this gap in the kind of teen years years into the early 20s, where kids might have the cognitive capacities that we associate with adulthood, but they don't have the psychosocial capacities that we typically associate with adulthood. And that is kind of the perfect storm that leads to a lot of risk-taking behavior at this time. Another analogy, I will say, I stole this one from my doctoral advisor back in the day. It's like starting an engine without a skilled driver. So imagine you have a car, and that's the cognitive capacity. The car is brand new, off the lot. There's gas in the tank. There's windshield wiper fluid in the car. And so everything about the car is ready to go. That's adolescent's cognitive capacity. But the driver has no experience at all. That's that psychosocial capacity. So that's why we often see so much risk-taking in the teen years, despite the fact that in many other ways, adolescents are reaching these kind of more adult capacities. So I'm going to have a summary slide like this after each section of the outline, just to make sure we're on the same page in case you zoned out for a little bit. So my summary for this section is that youth are qualitatively different than adults in the way that they think, reason, and engage in risk-taking behavior because of their brain development. Obviously, there's a ton more research than what I just presented about this, and I'm happy to chat with anyone who has questions about it. But that is kind of the gist. So that's the quick summary here, is that we know that youth are qualitatively different than adults in a way that impacts their decision-making and reasoning. So next, I want to talk about youth resources. What do I mean by resources? There's lots of different types of resources. Resources aren't necessarily just financial resources, although that's often where our brains go first. We already talked about one type of resource, that's neurological resources. And so we just talked in the last section about how youth neurological resources are not the same as adults. They don't have the same psychosocial capacities as adults, which leaves them vulnerable to being highly sensation-seeking, being really, really interested in peer influence, not being able to plan for the future very well, being quite impulsive. And so those neurological resources that we typically see among adults, youth don't necessarily have. So we talked about that one. But there are lots of other resources as well that youth sometimes lack. And particularly that could be knowledge about the way that the juvenile justice system works, or environmental resources that put them at a disadvantage and may make them more likely to engage in behavior that then leads them to be arrested, or more likely to be caught when they engage in behavior that otherwise might not be brought to the attention of law enforcement. So first, let's talk about knowledge resources. Youth have very limited legal understanding. They really lack the ability to understand their rights, responsibility, courtroom procedures, and there's a ton of research on this. So research by lots of folks, some were qualitative interviews, suggest that most youth do not understand their rights. They may have heard the Miranda warning before, but aren't quite sure what that means. And we also know that your rights extend well beyond just the Miranda warning. They are particularly confused about the roles of various legal actors. So I see this all the time in my research. I'll try to distinguish, how did you feel about the judge versus your probation officer versus the police officer? And kids have a really hard time. So if they had a bad experience with the police officer, that kind of bleeds into their experience with other legal actors. They have a hard time describing what is the role of each different legal actor, a hard time knowing, for example, that your probation officer isn't the same as a therapist. And so then sometimes youth will disclose something to a probation officer that ends up getting them in more trouble, whereas what they were hoping for was help. So confusion about the roles of legal actors is really common among adolescents. A lot of youth also did not know it was possible to be transferred to adult court. And so some youth who were transferred to adult court, who then were criminally charged in the adult court system, did not even know that that was a thing. And many youth have reported that they would have thought differently about their crime or not engaged in their crime if they had had a better understanding of legal repercussions. Now, we can quibble with that because we know that risky behavior that happens by youth is often kind of impulsive. And so knowing better doesn't necessarily mean that they would have done something differently in those kind of hot cognition moments. But that is what qualitative interviews with youth reflect. There's also been some experimental research on youth legal understanding, and that suggests that youth have significantly less understanding of courtroom procedures and rights than adults do, to the extent that if there were a competency hearing, for example, they might be considered incompetent to stand trial, although that's not a thing in the juvenile court system. Importantly, youth's knowledge of the justice system is not a function of their experience. I work with a lot of legal actors, a lot of juvenile court folks, and they'll often say, well, this kid has been through the court a couple of times, so he or she knows what to do. That's not true. What the research suggests is that within the juvenile justice system, there are no differences in legal knowledge between youth who are incarcerated, youth who are on probation, and youth who have never been arrested. So it's not a function of whether or not you have experience in the juvenile justice system or even how intensive that experience was, right? So youth who are incarcerated likely have penetrated more deeply into the justice system than youth who were just on probation. But there are no differences in legal knowledge. And for youth who are transferred to the criminal justice system, the adult court system, they have an even more limited understanding of the system and its actors. So next, I want to pivot to talk about some environmental resources that youth may or may not have. And I want to give the caveat that obviously there are always exceptions to each of these, so I don't mean to say that any of these are a rule. I'm speaking in generalities here just to give you a picture of what the experience is like for many youth. So I often think about the fact that adults, because they are the age of majority, have a lot more opportunity to change some of these environmental resources than youth do. So, for example, although of course we know this is not possible for everyone for myriad reasons, if adults want to move out of their neighborhood, that is a possibility. It might be a faint, distant possibility because of myriad systemic oppressions, but adults do have more of an ability to kind of save money and move elsewhere if they want to change their neighborhood resources. However, youth are subject to the living conditions imposed on them by their guardians. They have no opportunity to change kind of the neighborhood resources that surround them. They can't vote for different representatives in their local community. They can't move out on their own unless they go through the emancipation process, etc. The same is true for the social environment. Adults have kind of more degrees of freedom here. Adults could choose to quit a toxic job, they could choose to make different friends, but youth are typically subject to the social environment that's available to them at school, home, and neighborhood. There's not a lot of opportunity for youth in most cases to say, you know what, this social milieu is not working for me, and so I'm going to simply find a different one. Of course, youth could ask to transfer schools, and maybe that's available to some of them, but for the most part, on average, it's really difficult for them to change their social environment. And the same is true for their family environment. Some adults choose estrangement from relatives that may be harmful to them in various ways. However, youth, because they are minors, rely on family members for the basics, right? For food, shelter, clothing, etc. And in fact, there are legal ramifications for any dysfunction within the family, right? And so a court may decide that a youth needs to be removed from their family environment. That's not necessarily a decision that the youth can make on their own. Again, there's always exceptions to all of these rules. I'm speaking generalities. So what really strikes me as a juvenile justice researcher is that while many of my colleagues study kind of crime among adults, I notice that the latitude, the degrees of freedom that adults have is really quite broader than that youth have. And so youth have relatively few environmental resources available to them because they are minors. And in fact, we know that youth who tend to commit serious crimes are more likely to have been exposed to childhood, to violence during childhood, to have had those ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, to have a history of family criminality, and to have serious mental health needs relative to youth who were never arrested. And when I see these statistics about how much more likely youth who are involved in the justice system are to be exposed to violence, for example, I just think about the fact that oftentimes that's because as minors, they are not able to limit their exposure to violence in the way that adults might be able to. So my summary slide here is that youth enter the justice system with pretty limited resources. We talked about how their brain development means that they don't think about decision making in the same way as adults, but also they don't have the legal knowledge that some adults have about what to do when they're in the justice system, and they also don't have the kind of more environmental resources, or at least the ability to impact or change the environmental resources available to them. So youth are entering the justice system with limited resources. Lastly, I want to talk about youth crime and parents. So the segue here is that we talked about how youth, because they are minors, don't necessarily have the latitude to act independently in the same way that adults do. And a kind of founding tenet of the juvenile justice system is that youth's parents will kind of guide them through the process, that parents or guardians will be there to kind of help them and help kind of fill in the gaps that they as minors have. And that is where most of my research falls. So I want you to imagine a kid. I'm naming this kid Kevin after my younger brother, just to troll him a little bit. So imagine a 15-year-old kid named Kevin. And imagine that Kevin's walking home from school with some friends. One of them has, a can of spray paint, and they think, wouldn't it be fun to spray paint the side of this building? It wasn't necessarily something they planned ahead of time. Probably wasn't something Kevin would have done on his own, but he's in the heat of the moment, and he says, yeah, that would be fun. I'm with my friends. I'm not really thinking about future consequences. This seems like a fun experience I could do right now that would feel really rewarding in my brain. We know that's how a lot of youth crime takes place. Usually it's in groups with friends, whereas adults tend to commit crimes on their own. For youth, it's usually with a group of friends. We know it's usually not something that was planned out. It's usually something a bit impulsive. And we know it's usually something kind of more minor, is what we would consider most youth crime. A lot of youth crime is property crime. However, it is not Kevin's lucky day. Unfortunately, a police officer drives by, sees the kids, and Kevin is arrested for vandalism. The first thing that's going to happen is that we're going to assume that Kevin has a parent or a guardian who is now going to kind of step in and maybe give him a ride back from the police station, maybe kind of figure out, okay, what are the next steps here? Do we need to pay a fine? When are our court hearings, etc.? So there's this implicit assumption when we hear this story about Kevin that the next part of the story is going to involve some kind of adult, parent, guardian, etc. But what does it actually look like when parents are navigating the legal context? I want to give an analogy here. So if you have school-aged kids, for example, or maybe you remember from when you were a student yourself, there's this idea that parental involvement in school is really important, right? So the more parental support you have, the more kind of the child is going to be successful in school. So for example, parents who really value an education, they have a more positive attitude toward the value of education. Those youth are more likely to be successful. Parents who are really knowledgeable about their kids' education experience. So they know the name of the teacher. They know when the test is. They know when the homework's due. They know when the spelling test is, etc. Those parents tend to have youth who are more successful in school. And then the parents who put in some more effort, right? The parents who are showing up to the parent-teacher conference, the parents who are quizzing the kid on the spelling words. Those types of efforts are usually associated with youth academic success. And so this is kind of taken as a given, both in the education literature and also kind of in pop culture generally, is that this kind of attitude, knowledge, effort, that's what we're looking for from parents when their child is in school. So what about parental support when a child is arrested? Well, we can see how those same factors might be associated with youth success on probation. So parents who have the attitude that it's important to abide by the law, maybe their youth are less likely to get rearrested. Parents who have like kind of the knowledge, the savvy, the know-how to help their child navigate the juvenile justice system, maybe their youth are more likely to be successful on probation. And parents who are putting in the effort, who are showing up to the court dates, who are meeting with the probation officer, maybe they're more likely to have children who are successful on probation. And success here we're measuring as not recidivating or not committing an additional crime. So this is an empirical question, and we've done a series of studies to test these empirical questions, and I'll kind of summarize them here. So we'll start with attitude. So when I talk about attitude toward the justice system, that's the legal institutions or the law broadly is fair and legitimate. And so there's this idea called legal socialization, wherein parents' attitudes shape youth attitudes, kind of across different things. So you get your political views from your parents, typically your religious views, your views about gender ideology, etc. You get a lot of attitudes and values from your parents. But what about your attitudes toward the justice system? Well, we know that when people feel the justice system is less legitimate, they feel more justified in breaking the law, which makes sense, right? They're like, well, that law is not fair, so I don't feel that bad about breaking it. So we know that the less legitimate people feel the justice system is, then the more likely they are to commit a crime or to recidivate if they've already committed a crime. So what does it mean for youth? This is a really ugly SEM model, and so I promise there's going to be some animations so you know what you're looking at, but just focus on the kind of 3 colored boxes in the middle here. What we found was holding constant some other factors that might be related to attitudes toward the justice system or to criminal behavior, like youth age, race, self-reported priors, country of origin, parents' own offending, own arrests, etc. So holding constant kind of anything we could think of that might be related to attitudes toward the justice system. What we found was that mothers who had a more positive attitude toward the justice system had youth who were less likely to reoffend a year later. And that was mediated through son's own attitude. So what that means is, as moms thought the justice system was more legitimate, so did their children. And then those children in turn were less likely to reoffend a year later. So the take-home message here, if you're like, wow, I really hate looking at these boxes and numbers, the take-home message here is that parents socialize their children's attitudes about the justice system, which in turn impacts recidivism. Now you might say, why do we care about this? We care because any intervention that the justice system tries to put in place is not going to be effective if the parents aren't on board. You can imagine if you're a teenager, you get arrested, you've got this probation officer telling you again and again, it's really important that you follow the law is really important, you've got to make sure that you don't break the law again. Fine. But if you go home, every day to a family that says, listen, the justice system doesn't care about people who look like us. The justice system is not fair. The justice system is not here to support us. Obviously, that attitude that you are kind of re-entering day in and day out is going to override any intervention of a probation officer that you just met, that you don't necessarily trust, that you don't really understand what their role is, telling you, hey, actually, you're supposed to follow the law. And so oftentimes we put in place these interventions in the juvenile justice system that are just acting on the child as an individual, when in fact, without paying attention to the family system, it's unlikely that there will be a change. So let's go back to our kind of attitude, knowledge, effort, and now focus on knowledge. So by knowledge, what I mean is what is accurately known about how the juvenile justice system functions. We already talked about this a little bit before. I told you youth know pretty much nothing about how the juvenile justice system works, and implicit and sometimes explicit in juvenile courts is the idea that even though youth don't know much about the justice system, their parents surely will, and their parents will help guide them. It's literally written into the Canadian Youth Justice Act, for example. It's like, don't even worry about how little kids know about the justice system. Their parents will know all what to do. And so that's an empirical question, right? So I often work with folks in the juvenile court who will say, these parents don't even care, they don't even show up, they have no idea what's going on. And I'm like, well, is it that they don't care or that they don't know what they're supposed to be doing? And so to test this idea, we gave parents a series of true, false questions, and I'm just going to give you a little flavor of them right now. So these questions were kind of some basic stuff about the juvenile justice system, like if I, as a parent, pay for a lawyer for my child, then I am the one who gets to decide how he will plead. Or conversations I have with my son's probation officer are confidential or kept private. And a public defender is a lawyer who represents the victim. Now, probably everyone who's listening to this webinar knows that all three of those things are false. Those are not true. The parent does not get to decide how a youth will plead, even if they're the one paying for the lawyer. Conversations with a probation officer are not confidential. They are not kept private. A public defender, we know, does not represent the victim. And so all of these were false. Of course, across my true-false test, there were 44 questions. Half were true, half were false. I'm showing you these ones because these three questions were three of the most frequently missed questions. And so parents didn't know. These were actual parents whose child was currently involved in the juvenile justice system and had been for at least a couple months. And these parents, even then, did not know, for example, that if they told their son's probation officer, yeah, he's not been going to school, a lot of them expected that to be kept private and then felt really betrayed when the probation officer went around and told the judge, and now the son's got a bench warrant because they're violating probation, etc. And so there were real serious repercussions for the lack of legal knowledge that parents were evincing for their children who were currently involved in the justice system. Oops. Oh yeah, so sorry, I forgot I had this here. So this is the percent correct. So for the probation officer example, for example, it's a true-false question, and only a third of people, less than a third of people, got that one right. They would have done better if they were just randomly guessing. So across this true-false test, you'll notice I've kind of truncated the x-axis here at the bottom. But across this true-false test, we've got the percent correct here on the x-axis. We've got the number of parents, in this case it was mothers, who scored on the y-axis. And what we found was that in general, moms whose kids were currently on probation really had pretty limited knowledge of the juvenile justice system. The average score was about a 66% correct. I'm a professor. I would be quite concerned if I gave an exam and the average score was 66% correct. Something's going wrong with how I'm communicating the information. The highest score was a 93% correct. And honestly, that was an outlier because that woman happened to work as a paralegal. So she had some insider information that helped her get such an unusually high score. And so on average, these moms whose kids were currently involved in the justice system had really, really limited knowledge of that system. And in fact, a bunch of them scored below chance. So they would have done better if they had just randomly guessed on all 44 items. What I was most interested in, however, was the people who scored below the mean. So the people who failed the test, if you will, the people who really had quite limited knowledge of the juvenile justice system. And perhaps unsurprisingly, what we found was these were more likely to be women who were not white, women who were not native English speakers or who did not speak any English, women from the lowest third of income and the lowest third in education. And so what this tells me is that women who are already facing systemic oppression and various forms of marginalization due to these kind of other factors in their life are now at a further disadvantage because they don't understand how to support their youth through the juvenile justice system experience, which can have serious legal repercussions for their child. So through no fault of their own, there's kind of this compounding of their marginalization via this expectation that they come into the juvenile justice system already knowing exactly what they're supposed to know. Importantly, we did a follow-up to the study. So we went back to the same moms. We gave them the same test 2 years later. I think it was 2.5 years later. So we've got time 2 is that dark line. Time 1 is the dotted line. And moms did not do any better at all. So even though we were like, well, maybe once they've had some more time and exposure to the juvenile justice system, maybe they'll score a little better. That was not the case. The average scores were statistically not significantly different. And you can see there wasn't much movement in terms of their average knowledge of the juvenile justice system. Lastly, I want to talk about effort or the degree of engagement that parents have in their youth's legal proceedings. And then we'll kind of get back to knowledge because that knowledge and effort piece are going to be related, as you'll see here. So in one study, we asked mothers, you might say, why do you keep talking about mothers? It's because the vast majority, and I think in this particular study, it was 85% of the arrested youth we were working with said that their guardian was a female, and particularly a biological mother, sometimes a biological grandmother. So for shorthand, I keep saying mothers. You just might have noticed that on the slides. So what we in this study, we asked mothers about their participation in their youth legal proceedings. So among a group of youth who were arrested, we asked their moms, like, how much did you do each of these things? And so it's things like meeting with the lawyer, going to the court date, helping with the probation requirements, meeting with the probation officer, etc. And we saw that most moms were, doing a lot of those things. You'll see not a lot of moms were giving advice, although given their lack of legal knowledge, perhaps that's a good thing. But what we were really interested in was why not? So for the women who said, no, I wasn't able to do that, figuring out why. And a lot of times it was because of more structural barriers. So for example, a lot of moms were saying, I would have loved to go to the court date. I would have loved to be there, but I had to work. As many of you might know, if you have experience working with the justice system, a lot of times court dates get moved, stuff gets bumped from one day to the next, a judge gets busy, then somebody's on vacation, etc. And so what was happening was parents were taking time off of work for their youth court date, only for that court date to be moved, and now they're out of days off. And so they're like, what am I supposed to do? Like, I can't lose my job. I need to be able to support my family, but I don't have any more days off. I guess I just can't go to the court date. A lot of parents were also surprised by the sheer number of meetings that were expected. So between meetings with the lawyer, court dates, because in the juvenile justice system, you've got the dispositionary hearing, the adjudicatory hearing, there's all these different hearings, each of which might involve several different court dates. And then there's all the probation officer meetings. And so a lot of parents expressed a lot of surprise about that. And they're like, listen, I would have loved to be there, but all of these meetings are supposed to be happening during the time that I'm working, and I just can't make it to all of them. I can't make it to every lawyer meeting, every PO meeting, every court date. There's just no way that I can do that while balancing my other childcare duties and my work schedule. And so importantly, I told you we'd bring it back to the legal knowledge piece. Importantly, we found that parents' legal knowledge was also related to their kind of effort, their participation. Here again is a big, ugly SEM model. If you're not a person who likes SEM models, then you can ignore it. If you are, then you can see that we tried to account for anything we could think of that might be related to legal participation, to reoffending, to legal knowledge, etc. But if you're not interested in that, we can ignore it. The take-home message is here. So what we found was that moms who knew less about the justice system were more likely to have kids who reoffended a year later. And in part, about 42% of that effect was mediated through effort. So what that means in kind of plain English is that parents who knew more about the justice system participated more, and then in turn had kids who reoffended less. So a lot of times what happens in the juvenile justice system is that those kids who are reoffending, it's not necessarily because, they're bad kids or the rehabilitative efforts have failed. It's because of these more structural barriers, right? So it's because their parents don't really understand their legal rights and responsibilities. It's because their parents, like, literally cannot make it to kind of be more involved because of, how difficult it can be for them to balance these different financial pressures with being in attendance at their child's legal proceedings. And so there are these other family level factors that we see are impacting youth recidivism. And oftentimes in the juvenile justice system, we just think of, okay, if a youth recidivates, it's because of something about the youth, right? So maybe there was something, in the environment that got them involved in crime in the first place, but then due to the rehabilitative efforts of the juvenile court that have acted on the youth, now the youth is rehabilitated, and if they reoffend, then it's something about the kid. But what this research suggests is oftentimes the kind of more structural, systemic, and like family level factors are really impacting youth's reoffending in a way that's not necessarily taken into account in current juvenile justice practice. So if I had to give kind of a summary for this section here, it's that juvenile justice system involvement and family life are highly intertwined, not just because children are minors, and so legally, yes, their guardians need to be part of the process, but also because the way that our society is set up suggests that structural barriers that impact the family then have downstream consequences for youth's own success when they're in the juvenile justice system. system. And so for that reason, families need resources. There's not necessarily time to get into it today, but a lot of my more recent research has pivoted toward what can those resources look like, what's the impact of providing those resources, et cetera. But this is kind of the main take-home point that I want to leave you with, is that there is no way to think about youth rehabilitation, juvenile justice system contact without considering what does the family context look like and what are kind of the rehabilitative levers that we can pull on the family. What are the structural barriers in place for the family? What are the emotional resources that the family needs? And so the family and the youth are really so intertwined in a way that impacts success within the juvenile justice system. That's what I'd like you to take from this. Okay. Again, I'm Kate Cavanagh. I know we have some time for question answer, but if you find yourself short on time, you can always feel free to email me. That's it's my professional email address. If you're just interested in learning more about my research, I run a research lab called the Adolescent Development and the Justice System Lab, or the Adjust Lab. You can check our website at theadjustlab.com, and that's where we do a lot of kind of updates about new papers that are coming out, projects that we're currently working on, et cetera. I've got a great group of doctoral students who work with me as well, so their work's up there too. So if you'd like to keep in touch or learn more about my work, those are two resources. But otherwise, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can do some question and answer.
Yes, thank you so much. That was wonderful, and you really broke down some important points that I think for considering this work. And good thing we have some time because we have a lot of questions.
Oh, good.
The first one, well, a few people asked this, but has there been any research looking at the effect of giving legal education to moms like in that intervention?
I am so glad you asked. Yes. So a couple of ways. So before I was at MSU, I was living in California. So this was work that happened in California. I had first done this research in California. I presented it to the court actors I was working with. I was like, hey, the people in your court system have no idea what's going on and really could use some help. And so we jointly created a little pamphlet. It's on my bookshelf somewhere behind me that you can't see blurred out. But we created a little pamphlet. It was just kind of a tri-fold brochure. That was just like, hey, you're new to the juvenile justice system. Here are some things that you need to know, like some vocabulary, some quick. So it was very short, very quick intervention. And we found that intervention alone reduced bench warrants in the county in the juvenile court by 25%. Because a lot of times kids were getting bench warrants because they didn't know they were supposed to be somewhere and their parents didn't know and they didn't have a ride and they weren't sure what that hearing was and if they were supposed to be at it, which can quickly escalate how deeply they penetrate the justice system. And so even just that simple pamphlet had an impact. Now in Michigan, I am working with some of my collaborators here to create like an intro video. So we're trying to create like a 5-minute kind of YouTube thing that we can link to, like maybe have a QR code kind of posted up around the juvenile court and then direct parents to kind of more actively when they are first meeting with a probation officer. And so we're working on developing that now, and then we're going to do kind of a pre-post look at not only parents' knowledge, but also various juvenile justice outcomes within the county. So that's something we're excited about. That's something that's still in development. But there is some limited evidence from the previous work that even just a pamphlet is really helpful. Parents just, they have no idea. They don't know. And what I found really interesting, kind of anecdotally in my personal life, a lot of my friends and family members who are not associated with kind of any criminal justice, juvenile justice work, they tend to know a lot more about the criminal justice system than the juvenile justice system just through pop culture. So they're like, yeah, like I've watched Law and Order SVU, and so I'm familiar with this, that, and the other, but the vocabulary in the juvenile justice system is completely different. So there is no sentencing hearing, right? Instead, it's a dispositionary hearing. There is no like, oh, you're found guilty. Instead, you are adjudicated. And so not only are they bigger words in the juvenile court, but it's an entirely different set of vocabulary. So a third study I want to talk about that I'm developing right now with a clinician who studies language disorders. We are working on developing a list of kind of all the legal terminology for the juvenile court and for the adult court that someone might know. And then we are going to give that to youth, justice-involved youth and community youth, and also test them for various learning disabilities and language disorders so that we can see, is it true that kids actually kind of know more about the adult system than they do the juvenile justice system? What are the vocabulary words that they're really seeming to struggle with? Is that related to a learning disability? Is it just because they're big and unfamiliar words like adjudication? I didn't know what that was till I was halfway through my PhD program. And so we are looking to test empirically to understand specifically where are the deficits and for whom do those deficits exist in legal understanding.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And personally, as a clinician that works with youth, I would be thrilled to learn more about that and to see the outcomes of those. Um, and relatedly, there was a question of, has any research looked at if there's a difference in efficacy between something like a brochure and a parenting class?
Really good question. I don't know of any research that's compared those sorts of things directly. We do know, so a big problem in my line of work is courts are like, oh yeah, we're going to do a parenting intervention. And a lot of times that can mean something drastically different, right? It will like, what is the parenting intervention? Like, what does that mean? And so is it a parenting intervention specifically around legal knowledge? Is it one around emotion regulation? Is it one around parenting skills? Are you talking about a family therapy? And so it can often be really hard, even just when I'm kind of writing a literature review and trying to, refresh myself on the most recent literature. I'll be looking for parenting interventions, and that can mean a bajillion different things. And so I'm not aware of any research that compares those two types of interventions specifically, but I also just want to raise the fact that parenting intervention, that looks way different, and different courts just kind of use that interchangeably, even though they might mean way different things. I found that even just within the state of Michigan, I work with 4 or 5 different counties, and all of them are like, oh yeah, of course we have family therapy. And each of their family therapy looks completely different goals, different process, different outcomes. So that's a big challenge in this space. Everyone says they're doing stuff with families or stuff with parents, but what is it specifically? And are we comparing apples and oranges when we're looking at efficacy?
Sure. Yeah, there's just a lot of variability, especially
Oh
in
yeah.
the youth system. There was also a question about, brain development and trauma literature is often cited by attorneys as to why 17-year-olds that commit murder should not be transferred to adult criminal court. And then this is balanced by the fact that a vast majority of adolescents and traumatized youth don't go on to commit violent crime. So, do you have any guidance on how juvenile court judges should balance these issues when making important decisions about things like transfer?
These are all such great questions. Yeah, so I actually presented to the Prosecuting Attorneys Association for the state of Michigan like a couple weeks ago, so it's fresh on the mind. And a lot of what we are talking about is those difficult decisions that judges or sometimes prosecutors need to make about transferring youth who are either chronic serious offenders or who have committed a very serious offense. Unfortunately, there's no great answers there. Here's what I have to say, though. What the research does suggest is that transferring youth to adult court usually has pretty bad outcomes, not just for the youth themselves. So youth who are transferred to adult court are much more likely to be victimized while they're incarcerated. They're much more likely to have suicidal ideation or to attempt suicide. But it also has pretty negative repercussions for community safety. So there have been a couple of studies, not that I've done, but who are looking at matched samples of youth who've committed the same type of crime, have the same kind of rap sheet, who were and were not transferred to adult court. And the ones who are not transferred to adult court actually tend to recidivate less. So there's not a lot of evidence that transferring youth to adult court works, either in terms of having the kind of deterrent effect that we would like or the rehabilitative effect that we'd like. And it also seems to expose youth to additional violence. Some work that I did do, this was really interesting. I actually started out as a collaboration I did with a museum. We created a museum exhibit exhibit based on the letters that were written by people who are now adults, but who were incarcerated in the adult court system for crimes they committed as youth. So they wrote us a series of letters. Some of them chose to draw pictures, other artwork, music lyrics, etc. And we started out just kind of, we're like, oh, we'll do this cool university museum collaboration. But then we did a qualitative analysis of those letters and some of the images that we had been sent. And we found a couple of really important themes about this group of people who, again, were now they're adults, but they were reflecting on their time having committed a really serious crime as a youth and now being incarcerated for a life or near life sentence. And a lot of what came through was just like, I can't believe how much I've grown since then. I feel like a different person. It's really a shame that I don't have the ability to show that growth. I'd really like to be a community member again. I have all these ideas for how I could help and benefit. Some of them were actively volunteering or trying to start, nonprofits. And so it came through in a lot of the letters that we received that they're like, I'm just so different than I was then. It just seems a shame that, I'm still kind of paying the price here. And so that was a really eye-opening experience for me. I'm a quantitative researcher. A lot of times researchers get really kind of wrapped up in the numbers, and we don't necessarily hear the individual stories as much. And so it was really eye-opening to me to kind of hear about those experiences. So that's another paper you can check out if you're interested. But broadly, there's no great answers to that. I know that there are community pressures, public safety pressures, political pressures when it comes to transferring youth to adult court. And I totally get that. So I understand those pressures, but I am also a person who believes we should follow the research, and the research suggests that transferring youth to adult court is typically not very effective.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a lot to consider in those, but it's helpful when you can stick to the data. Somebody was also wondering about how do you understand or how do you conceptualize parents whose justice socialization is developed from actual systemic injustices?
Yeah, I'm really glad I got that question. So earlier in my career, I was very interested in that area of legal socialization. And I'm like, this totally makes sense. The parents are teaching their kids how to feel about the justice system. And so that's a great intervention point. And then through the course of having conversations with those families and collecting that data, I kind of radicalized myself to believe the opposite. And I'm like, a lot of times they feel that way for a very valid reason, right? Because of experiences that they or other family members have had. And so I don't think it's so much that we need to change how people feel about the justice system. It's that we need to change how legal actors interact with communities so that they are deserving of that trust. Because I totally understand why people from minoritized communities and marginalized communities don't trust justice system actors. And it's not fair to basically gaslight them and say, well, you should trust them anyway because it's just better and then your kid won't reoffend, right? That doesn't make sense at all. That trust needs to be earned through different behavior. And so I have kind of switched my mindset from where the point of intervention is. And I believe the point of intervention there is justice system practice. And so that's kind of the ball is in the court of justice system actors. If they would like to kind of build trust with communities, then that's what needs to happen. We can't just expect communities to obey the law or to feel that the law is legitimate or that legal actors are legitimate enforcers of that law when we know that certain communities are targeted.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. There's also some questions about if there are any handouts or resources that can be used, especially in different languages that outline kind of what to expect from court. Kind of it sounds like what you created as a brochure.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So one issue with the juvenile justice system, and I'm sorry if I'm complaining, I tend to get kind of soapboxy question answer, but one issue in the juvenile justice system is how decentralized it is. So whereas in the criminal justice system, there's a federal criminal justice system, right? And so certainly there are differences state to state, but the criminal justice system looks relatively similar state to state. state. The juvenile justice system, there is no federal system. There are limited Supreme Court cases that kind of touch on juvenile justice issues, but otherwise, juvenile justice is entirely within the hands of the state, and in most states, entirely within the hands of either the county or the city. So Michigan, where I currently live, highly decentralized juvenile justice system. The different counties that I work with have totally different operating procedures, serve totally different populations, et cetera. And so what I would say is in terms of developing any kind of materials to educational materials, I think it really has to be led by that local context, because it would be, I don't even know where I would begin if I was making just like a resource for everybody, because the justice system works, looks, sounds so different in those different jurisdictions. And so certainly I think it would be great if those materials could be developed, but I do think that that needs to be a little bit more almost grassroots, and so kind of led by the researchers or practitioners in a given area for that given area. Because otherwise, I mean, even when I moved from California to Michigan, I had to relearn so much of what I knew about the justice system. I do work in Pennsylvania, Texas, and Louisiana as well. And so I've had to kind of totally relearn what is the process, what's the vocabulary, what are the laws. And so absolutely, it would be great to have resources, but I think that those should be there. It should be really mindfully developed alongside kind of the local practitioners to make sure that the right information is being put in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and so several people are asking about, where to get some of the citations or get this information that you're talking about. And I'm assuming you would reference your contact and your website
Yes.
that you already mentioned. Okay.
Oh yeah, feel free to email me.
Okay. And then there's also some questions, if people can use your slides today to be able to present to other people, like in their therapy, like in a family therapy setting, to show them
Absolutely.
some of that
Yeah. I
information.
mean, please credit me, but but otherwise, yeah, absolutely. That's totally fine. I love giving talks like these because it's my goal to spread the information. And so like, yes, please use it. It's not
Okay.
just for me to know and hoard. It's for everyone.
Okay. Thank you so much. And then do you have time for one more question? Okay. Um, there's so many. I'm just trying to see if I can kind of
Sure.
summarize one that gets at so many of these. So somebody's kind of commenting on their experience that they've also noticed that kind of lack of legal knowledge is a big component of how youth operate in the system or try to navigate this system, especially after their first offense. And they're wondering, do you have any other ideas about topics to discuss with youth that would help prevent future delinquency?
Topics aside from legal knowledge or kind of what within the legal knowledge sphere would be helpful?
Within the legal knowledge is what I'm
Okay,
getting.
gotcha. I really think the biggest issue I see in my research is youth not being able to distinguish among the legal actors. And so that's where they kind of unnecessarily get caught up in the revolving door of the court, is not understanding what is the expectation and role of these various legal actors, and knowing kind of who, in my experience, youth really don't know who is a therapist and who is kind of there to enforce the law and be more punitive. And so making sure that youth are aware, like who is a person to have what kind of conversation with. I often see kids getting tripped up on that unnecessarily. So if I had to pick kind of like a single legal knowledge intervention point for kids, I think it would be around legal actors and what their different roles are.
Okay. Okay. And then I'm just going to ask one more question because this has come up a few different ways,
Mhm.
but has there been any research or have you seen anything where, so let's say immediate caregivers or family are not able to be engaged or they're not engaged for whatever reason. Is there any research about, other adults or other caregivers, being supportive to the youth and the effectiveness of that?
So I can kind of anecdotally talk about what I've seen in my research. I can't cite like a specific study that's looked at what happens specifically when a grandma pops in. But we see, especially in like certain racial or ethnic groups, a lot of times, so I'm thinking of like Latinx Hispanic communities, a lot of times grandparents are super involved. And so if the parents aren't able to make it, then sometimes the grandparents are able to step in, aunts, uncles, older siblings. And so that's certainly something we see. In terms of adults outside of the family, I think that's where it gets tricky. So I used to be a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate, if you're familiar with the CASA program. And so those are youth who are going through who are wards of the state because of an abuse or neglect case. And so then there's this CASA person who kind of like helps represent them in court. Same for guardian ad litem, et cetera. And there just isn't as much research on the role of those sorts of adults or even the implementation of those sorts of adult roles when the youth is going through family court as the offender, not as the victim. So there are a lot more of kind of legal supports in place for outside adults to help youth through the family court system when the youth are the victims of abuse or neglect. But when
Mhm.
youth are the perpetrators, those same support systems for kind of outside adults really do not exist in the same way. If they do, it's kind of a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, and there's really not a lot of research on that. So that's a really great point.
Thank you so much for taking the time to break all of this down for us and lend your expertise. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation, and please feel free to email me, reach out anytime. I'm always happy to chat more or provide any resources that I can.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
That wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. Next week we will have Dr. Georgia Winters discussing applying research to practice in sexual grooming behaviors. We hope to see you then for another great discussion of issues of behavioral health and law. See you then.